Not all cover connections are perfect, however. So as you can see, these covers are spaced apart so that the enemy can see the gaps between. So now the player has to weigh their options. So obviously if they want to move to the middle cover, then they're at risk at getting spotted or shot at because the enemy has a view into these sort of gaps. If the enemy is aggro, but the player is sort of fast enough, maybe they can get to the center cover without being shot, but they sort of need to weigh their risks here. So if the enemy's unaware and the player's fast enough, the enemy might not have enough time to acquire the player as a target. It really depends a lot on the sort of tuning of the enemies and their acquire times and things like that, and that's a sort of analog space that the player sort of has to weigh as they're trying to figure out how they move around the battlefield like this. Or they could have to watch the enemy very closely and then cross these gaps when the enemy's looking or turns their head away. Or they could wait until they see if the enemy moves. So in this case, the enemy has moved here to the right, closing the gap here on the left and widening the gap on the right. So now the player has the opportunity to move completely occluded. So the player moves. So really, I mean, as far as connections between cover goes, there's really a full spectrum of cover connection risk. So the less the cover objects sort of overlap and block line of sight, the more the risk the player takes as they sort of move from one to another, and the more they need to sort of judge the enemies that are in play and watch their behavior, which way they're looking and things like that, so that they can move from place to place without being seen. So here, the enemy is aware of the player's position and the player is sort of forced to move from cover after the enemy throws a grenade next to the player, so this sort of area effect right here. So since the only cover option is far away, the enemy will have to have an opportunity to sort of shoot at the player as they try to make their way across that gap. If the battlefield had looked like this, for instance, the player might have been able to dodge this grenade, be exposed for less time as they sort of moved from position to position, and maybe transfer behind this pillar right here and get a shot on the enemy. So it is part of player strategy to plan cover movements to lead to more sort of advantageous positions that reduce their risk on the battlefield. You don't want to be in a vulnerable position when you are forced to run across a clearing or push through enemy-controlled areas. You'd rather sort of move from cover position to cover position, occluded as much as possible. And as much as games like we play like here are called shooters, shooting is really a very small part of what the game is. So in a cover-based shooter, think about the time you spend actually in the combat cycle. You see an enemy and you advance, and this is just kind of an approximate thrown together sort of thing just to show a point, but you spend a small time sort of advancing towards the enemy. You as you get closer, you get more careful, you take less risk, you take more time, you maneuver into position, you find a well-occluded position with a clear view on the enemy, and with a easy escape route if possible. At the right moment, you aim, fire, and shoot, and eliminate the target, hopefully. Then you go defensive again as you assess new threats and see where you can plan your move from now. And so the cycle then begins and repeats itself. And sure, there is quite a lot more variation to the experience, but my point is, in a cover-based shooter, the majority of the time we're actually we're not shooting, we're actually moving. The way we use the environment, the choices that we make, the risks that are paid off in the reward of successfully sort of taking down the enemy. So that's the actual shooting and the killing and the, I guess, getting overcoming the enemy, feeling that sense of mastery. That's really the climax to the combat cycle. It's not the most of the combat itself. Strictly a sort of skill-based moment. Aiming, shooting, it's precision and timing. And so I guess it's to me at least, I feel it's kind of one note. And so the moving part itself takes a lot of skill and timing, but also it takes strategy. It takes observing the environment, observing enemies, planning, reflexes, and mastery of many more kinds of skills. And so players are really engaging many more parts of their brain. So without movement, you pretty much just have this enemy and player behind cover, popping up occasionally like gophers, and to shoot and then dropping back down. And it's really not very exciting at all. It's essentially aiming and shooting. And so when you miss the moving, you miss so much of the gameplay experience. And so we do as much as possible to try to discourage this particular situation. So question is, how do we get the player to move around and force them to have fun? So encouraging player movement, how do we get the player to want to move around the battlefield? So there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. So let's start with some systemic ways that we can encourage this. So systemic, one thing we can do is something I've already kind of shown an example of, which is area of effect attacks, things like grenades and Molotovs, fire, that sort of thing. In order to, a grenade basically lands and tells you that within a certain amount of range, you're going to take damage. So this forces you to move away from it. If the cover isn't big enough to allow you to sort of move away from it safely, then you have to actually break from cover and move away from it. So that's a way to move the player. Another way is what my game director until recently, Bruce Straley, called spiky balls, which are essentially armored charging enemies. So